As the great Gautama Buddha once wisely said, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. This single truth explains why anger feels so destructive. Someone says something careless, someone disrespects you, someone crosses a line, and before you realize it, your peace is gone. Your heart tightens, your thoughts race, and suddenly one moment controls your entire day. Buddhism teaches something radical and freeing. No one has the power to disturb your inner world unless you hand it over to them. The mind that reacts is not a strong mind. It is a trained habit running on autopilot. Today, you will learn how to stop giving people access to your emotions, how to remain unshaken even in provocation, and how to build a calm that cannot be stolen. This is not about suppressing anger. This is about becoming so aware that anger no longer finds a place to live inside you. 1. Anger is not caused by others. It is triggered by unseen attachment. Buddhism teaches something that completely changes how you see anger. Suffering does not come from what happens to you. It comes from what you cling to inside your own mind. When someone speaks harshly to you, disrespects you, ignores you, or behaves unfairly, it feels as if they have injected anger into you. But in truth, their words are only a trigger, not the cause. The real cause is the attachment you were already holding onto before the moment happened. You were attached to being respected, attached to being understood, attached to being treated a certain way, or attached to an image of how people should behave toward you. When reality breaks that inner rule, the mind reacts with anger, not because the situation is unbearable, but because the attachment has been threatened. Think about this carefully. Two people can hear the same insult, yet one remains calm while the other explodes with rage. If anger truly came from the other person, then everyone would react the same way. The difference lies in attachment. One person is deeply attached to their ego, their status, or their expectations, while the other is not. Buddhism helps you see that anger is not proof that someone harmed you. It is proof that something inside you was clinging too tightly. When you begin to understand this, a powerful shift happens. Instead of asking, "Why are people like this?" or "Why did they treat me this way?" you start asking a much more important question: what am I holding on to that made this hurt? Maybe it is the need for approval. Maybe it is the belief that you must always be respected. Maybe it is the desire to control how others see you. This question turns anger into a teacher rather than an enemy. Every time anger appears, it is pointing directly at an attachment that still controls you. Buddhism does not ask you to suppress anger or pretend it is not there. It asks you to observe it honestly, without judgment. When you watch your anger calmly, you begin to see its structure. You notice how it rises the moment an expectation is broken. You notice how it feeds on thoughts like, "This should not have happened," or "They should know better." And as you notice this clearly, anger begins to lose its power over you. It no longer feels like an uncontrollable force. It becomes understandable, predictable, and manageable. Over time, awareness replaces reaction. You stop fighting anger and start learning from it. You realize that anger is not telling you that the world is wrong, but that your attachment is too tight. As attachments loosen, anger naturally weakens. Peace does not come from changing people or situations. Peace comes from seeing clearly what you are attached to and gently letting it go. When attachment fades, anger has nowhere left to live. 2. What bothers you reveals where your mind is still untrained. Buddhism teaches that the mind is not automatically peaceful just because we wish it to be. The mind is shaped by habits, conditioning, and repeated reactions built over years. When something or someone bothers you deeply, it is not a sign that you are weak or failing. It is simply a sign that this area of the mind has not yet been trained with awareness. Just like an untrained muscle shakes under pressure, an untrained mind reacts when it encounters discomfort. The reaction is not the problem. The lack of understanding behind the reaction is. Many people believe that being spiritual or mindful means never feeling irritated, offended, or disturbed. Buddhism does not make this unrealistic demand. Instead, it teaches that every disturbance is a lesson revealing where attachment, fear, or insecurity still lives. When a comment, behavior, or situation repeatedly triggers you, it is pointing to something unresolved within. It may be pride, it may be the need for control, or it may be a deep desire for approval. The trigger itself is only the surface. The real work lies beneath it. Think of your mind as a mirror covered in dust. When the mirror is dusty, it cannot reflect clearly. External events simply touch the dust and cause disturbance. The more awareness you develop, the more gently that dust begins to settle. Each time you feel bothered and choose to observe instead of react, you are training the mind. You are teaching it to remain steady even when conditions are uncomfortable. Over time, what once felt unbearable becomes manageable, and what once provoked anger begins to feel distant and unimportant. Buddhism encourages you to use these moments as opportunities rather than failures. When irritation arises, you do not condemn yourself. You become curious. You watch how the body tightens, how the breath changes, how the thoughts begin to justify reaction. This observation itself weakens the habit. You are no longer fully inside the emotion. You are standing slightly apart from it. That small distance is where growth begins. As the mind becomes more trained, fewer things disturb it. Not because the world becomes kinder, but because the inner stability grows stronger. You begin to see clearly that being bothered is not caused by people being difficult, but by the mind demanding that reality behave differently. When that demand softens, peace naturally expands. The mind that understands its own triggers is no longer ruled by them. It becomes calm, not by force, but by wisdom. 3. Silence becomes power the moment you stop needing to be understood. One of the most subtle sources of anger is the need to be understood by others. Buddhism teaches that this need is rooted in ego and attachment, even though it often disguises itself as fairness or self-respect. When someone misunderstands you, judges you incorrectly, or forms an opinion that does not match your truth, the mind immediately feels threatened. The urge to explain, defend, or correct arises not because explanation will bring peace, but because the ego wants validation. This inner demand creates tension, and when that demand is blocked, anger follows. Silence becomes powerful when you understand that your peace does not depend on how others see you. Most people react emotionally not because of what was said, but because their identity feels challenged. Buddhism invites you to question this reaction gently. Ask yourself why being understood feels so necessary. You will often discover a hidden attachment to image, reputation, or approval. Once this attachment is seen clearly, it begins to loosen. The desire to speak weakens, and silence no longer feels like loss. It begins to feel like freedom. When you stop explaining yourself, something unexpected happens. Conflicts lose energy. Arguments collapse without fuel. People who seek reaction no longer find access to you. Silence does not mean suppression or fear. It means discernment. You choose not to spend emotional energy on battles that do not lead to inner clarity. Buddhism does not teach you to disappear or accept harm, but it teaches you to respond wisely rather than react emotionally. True power lies in restraint guided by awareness. Silence also allows you to see more clearly. When you are not busy defending your position, you begin to observe the situation as it is. You notice the emotions of others, the motivations behind their words, and the impermanence of their judgments. Most opinions are temporary, shaped by mood, misunderstanding, or personal pain. When you realize this, the urge to correct others fades naturally. You no longer feel attacked by passing thoughts that were never solid to begin with. Over time, silence becomes a shield rather than a weakness. The mind becomes spacious. Anger loses its urgency because there is no longer a need to protect an image. You understand that those who truly know you do not require explanation, and those who misunderstand you were never listening from clarity anyway. Buddhism teaches that peace grows where ego dissolves. When the need to be understood disappears, anger has nothing left to defend, and silence becomes a quiet expression of inner strength. 4. You are not your emotions, You are the awareness watching them. One of the most liberating teachings in Buddhism is the realization that you are not your emotions. Most suffering exists because people believe that whatever they feel is who they are. When anger arises, they say, "I am angry." When hurt appears, they say, "I am hurt." This identification traps the mind inside the emotion and gives it power. Buddhism gently invites you to see something different. Emotions are experiences that arise within you, but they are not your identity. You are the awareness that notices them. Think about how emotions behave. Anger appears suddenly, grows intense, then fades away. Sadness comes, stays for a while, then dissolves. If emotions were truly you, they would be permanent. But they are not. They come and go like weather in the sky. Buddhism uses this image to help you understand that awareness is the sky and emotions are passing clouds. The sky does not fight the clouds, nor does it become damaged by them. It simply allows them to pass. When you begin to observe emotions instead of merging with them, a subtle but powerful distance forms. Anger may still arise, but it no longer consumes you. You notice it in the body as heat, tension, or tightness. You notice it in the mind as repetitive thoughts demanding reaction. Instead of obeying these impulses, you remain present and watch. This watching is not cold or disconnected. It is gentle, curious, and calm. The moment an emotion is observed without judgment, it begins to lose its grip. Buddhism teaches mindfulness as the practice of staying with what is happening without becoming lost in it. When anger arises and you stay aware of it, something remarkable happens. The emotion runs out of energy. It no longer feeds on resistance or identification. Most anger lasts much longer than necessary because the mind keeps replaying the story behind it. Awareness interrupts this cycle. You see the emotion clearly without adding fuel, and because all emotions are impermanent, it naturally fades. This practice also builds deep inner strength. You stop fearing emotions because you know they cannot control you unless you identify with them. You learn that you can feel anger without becoming cruel, feel sadness without becoming hopeless, and feel frustration without losing peace. Awareness becomes your anchor. No matter what arises, there is a stable presence within you that remains untouched. Over time, this understanding transforms your relationship with life. You stop reacting automatically and start responding wisely. You no longer feel ashamed of emotions, nor enslaved by them. You see them as visitors that arrive, deliver a message, and leave. Buddhism does not promise a life without emotion, but it offers something far greater: freedom from being ruled by emotion. When you live as awareness rather than reaction, anger may knock on the door, but it no longer enters your heart. 5. People act from their own suffering, not from a desire to hurt you. One of the most powerful shifts Buddhism offers is the understanding that most human behavior is driven by inner suffering rather than deliberate cruelty. When someone speaks harshly, behaves unfairly, disrespects you, or provokes anger, it feels personal. The mind immediately assumes intention. It believes the other person wanted to hurt you. Buddhism gently invites you to look deeper. Most people are not acting from clarity. They are acting from pain they have not understood, fear they have not faced, and wounds they have not healed. When a person is at peace, their actions naturally carry patience and kindness. When a person is confused or suffering internally, their behavior becomes sharp, defensive, or careless. This suffering often has nothing to do with you. It may come from stress, insecurity, jealousy, unmet expectations, or past trauma. Yet because the pain has no clear outlet, it spills outward onto whoever is closest or most available. Understanding this does not excuse harmful behavior, but it frees you from personalizing it. Buddhism teaches compassion not as moral superiority, but as clear seeing. When you truly see that another person is acting from their own turmoil, anger begins to soften. You stop asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" and start seeing, "They are struggling." This shift dissolves resentment, because resentment depends on the belief that the harm was intentional and targeted. When that belief weakens, so does the emotional charge. This understanding also protects your inner peace. If you carry every harsh word as a personal attack, you allow others to control your emotional state. Buddhism teaches that peace is an internal responsibility. When you see others as expressions of their own suffering, their behavior loses the power to disturb you deeply. You may still set boundaries, you may still walk away, but you do so without hatred in your heart. Compassion also interrupts the cycle of anger. Anger feeds anger. Pain passed on becomes pain multiplied. When you respond with understanding rather than reaction, you break that chain. You refuse to add your suffering to theirs. This does not make you passive, it makes you free. You are no longer dragged into emotional battles that leave you exhausted and resentful. Over time, this perspective changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less defensive, and more grounded. You stop expecting emotional maturity from people who have not yet cultivated it. You stop being surprised by ignorance and cruelty. Instead, you meet life with realism and calm. Buddhism teaches that when wisdom replaces assumption, anger loses its foundation. When compassion replaces judgment, peace becomes natural. And when you understand that most harm is born from suffering, you no longer carry the weight of other people's pain inside your own heart. 6. The space between stimulus and response is where true freedom is born. Buddhism teaches that the most important moment in your entire emotional life is not the moment something happens to you, but the moment just after it happens. This moment is so small that most people never notice it. Someone insults you, disrespects you, ignores you, or behaves unfairly, and immediately the mind reacts. Words rush forward, the body tightens, thoughts begin to justify anger. In this instant, most people believe they have no choice. Buddhism reveals that this belief is an illusion. There is always a space between what happens and how you respond, and inside that space lives your freedom. The untrained mind collapses this space. It reacts instantly because it has been conditioned to do so. Years of habit have taught it that reaction equals protection, but reaction is not wisdom. Reaction is memory repeating itself. Buddhism teaches mindfulness as the practice of slowing down this moment, stretching it gently, and stepping into it with awareness. When you become aware of this space, even briefly, you break the chain of automatic suffering. At first, this space feels uncomfortable. The mind wants to react because reaction feels familiar and powerful. Silence feels weak to the ego. Stillness feels unsafe to a mind addicted to control. Buddhism does not ask you to force calm. It asks you to notice. When something triggers you, you notice the breath shortening. You notice the chest tightening. You notice the story forming in the mind. This noticing itself creates distance. You are no longer fully inside the reaction. You are standing at its edge. As you practice this again and again, the space grows. What once felt like an instant becomes several seconds. In those seconds, something extraordinary becomes possible. You can choose not to speak. You can choose to breathe. You can choose to walk away. You can choose to respond later rather than now. This choice is the foundation of emotional freedom. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not about controlling the world, but about freeing yourself from unconscious reaction. Most anger lasts far longer than it needs to, because the mind keeps feeding it. It replays the moment. It imagines future arguments. It builds narratives of injustice. The original event may have lasted seconds, but the suffering continues for hours or days. Mindfulness interrupts this cycle. When you stay present in the body and breath, the mind loses its ability to run endlessly. The emotion, deprived of fuel, begins to dissolve naturally. Buddhism also teaches that every reaction strengthens a habit. Each time you react without awareness, you train the mind to do the same again. Each time you pause and observe, you weaken the habit. This is why patience is not passive. Patience is active training. You are reshaping the nervous system. You are teaching the mind that it does not need to fight to survive. Over time, reactions soften not because you suppress them, but because they are no longer necessary. This practice also transforms your relationships. When you stop reacting immediately, you stop escalating conflict. Many arguments exist only because two untrained minds collide. One reaction invites another. When you refuse to react, the cycle breaks. The other person may continue, but their energy eventually collapses without resistance. Buddhism teaches that calm is contagious when it is genuine. Even if the other person does not change, you remain free. There will be moments when the pause feels difficult. Old wounds may surface. Strong emotions may arise. Buddhism teaches that these moments are not failures, they are deep practice. When pain arises, you stay with it gently. You breathe. You feel. You do not abandon yourself. The mind learns that it can experience discomfort without destruction. This realization is life-changing. You no longer fear emotions because you know they cannot control you. As the space between stimulus and response becomes a natural part of your life, something subtle shifts. You no longer feel the need to prove, defend, or attack. You respond with clarity rather than urgency. You speak when words are useful and remain silent when they are not. Your presence becomes steady. People may still try to provoke you, but their attempts fall flat because there is no reaction to grasp. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is not found in dramatic moments, but in ordinary situations handled with awareness. Every irritation becomes an opportunity. Every trigger becomes training. Every pause becomes liberation. When you live from this space, anger loses its power, not because the world has changed, but because you have. Freedom is no longer something you search for. It is something you practice, breath by breath, moment by moment, until calm becomes your natural state. 7. When you release the need to control, nothing can provoke you. At the deepest level, anger is not about what people say or do. Anger is born from resistance. It arises when the mind insists that reality must behave according to its rules. Buddhism teaches that much of human suffering comes from this silent demand for control. You want people to be fair, situations to be predictable, and life to unfold according to your expectations. When reality refuses, the mind tightens and anger appears. The problem is not reality. The problem is the belief that reality should obey your preferences. Control feels comforting to the ego because it creates an illusion of safety. The mind believes that if it can control people, outcomes, or perceptions, it can avoid pain. Buddhism gently reveals that this belief is false. Life is impermanent. People are inconsistent. Circumstances change without warning. Trying to control what is inherently uncontrollable exhausts the mind and guarantees frustration. Anger is often the emotional signal that control has failed. When someone provokes you, look closely at what the mind is demanding in that moment. It may be demanding respect, obedience, agreement, or validation. It may be demanding that someone behave differently so you can feel okay. Buddhism teaches that the moment you place your peace in the hands of others, you lose it. Peace that depends on external control is fragile. Peace that comes from acceptance is unshakable. Releasing control does not mean becoming passive or allowing harm. Buddhism makes a clear distinction between wisdom and resignation. You still set boundaries, you still walk away from what is harmful. But you do so without inner resistance. You do not argue with reality. You do not waste energy trying to change people who are not ready to change. You act where action is useful and let go where clinging only creates suffering. When you stop trying to control how others think of you, their opinions lose power. When you stop trying to control outcomes, disappointment loses intensity. When you stop trying to control people, conflict loses fuel. This release is not weakness, it is clarity. You see what is within your influence and what is not. Buddhism teaches that true strength lies in focusing your energy only where it can actually make a difference. Much anger comes from the belief that life owes you certain experiences. You believe you deserve fairness, gratitude, loyalty, or recognition. While these desires are human, attachment to them creates suffering. Buddhism invites you to meet life as it is, not as you wish it to be. When you accept that people will disappoint you and situations will not always align with your hopes, anger no longer feels necessary. Acceptance does not make you cold, it makes you free. As control loosens, trust begins to grow. You begin to trust your ability to handle whatever arises. You no longer need to control every interaction because you know you can remain steady, even in discomfort. This trust creates inner confidence. You stop reacting defensively because there is nothing left to defend. Your worth is no longer dependent on external behavior. Your peace no longer needs protection. Buddhism teaches that letting go is not a single decision, but a continuous practice. Each time anger arises, you notice the desire to control beneath it. You acknowledge it gently. You release it again and again. Over time, this practice reshapes the mind. The grip of control weakens. Situations that once triggered intense reactions begin to feel distant and manageable. Life does not become perfect, but your relationship with it becomes peaceful. When you fully understand this lesson, something profound happens. You stop asking, "How do I stop getting angry?" and start living in a way where anger rarely finds a place to arise. You no longer feel the need to win arguments, prove yourself, or correct everyone. You move through the world with quiet confidence and inner stability. People may still act from ignorance or pain, but their behavior no longer enters your inner space. At this stage, calm is no longer something you try to maintain. It becomes your natural state. You speak when it serves clarity and remain silent when it serves peace. You act when action is needed and let go when it is not. Anger loses its purpose because control has been released, resistance has softened, acceptance has taken root. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not found by changing the world, but by understanding it deeply and meeting it without attachment. When you stop fighting reality, reality stops fighting you. When you release control, nothing has the power to provoke you, because there is nothing left inside that needs defending. This is not indifference. This is inner liberation. This is the calm that cannot be stolen. 8. When you stop resisting life, peace becomes your natural state. At the deepest layer of anger, beneath reaction, beneath attachment, beneath control, there is resistance. Resistance is the silent argument you have with life. It is the inner voice that says, "This should not be happening. They should be different. I should not feel this, or life must make sense according to my expectations." Buddhism teaches that suffering does not come from pain itself, but from resisting pain. Pain is inevitable. Resistance is optional. Anger is what resistance feels like inside the body and mind. Most people live in constant resistance without realizing it. They resist unpleasant emotions, resist difficult people, resist uncomfortable truths, and resist uncertainty. This resistance creates friction, and friction creates anger. Buddhism invites you to stop fighting experience and start meeting it with awareness. When you stop arguing with reality, something remarkable happens. Reality stops feeling like an enemy. Resistance is exhausting because it requires constant mental effort. The mind keeps replaying what should have been different, what should not have happened, and what must be fixed immediately. Buddhism teaches that this endless mental struggle is unnecessary. Life unfolds according to causes and conditions far beyond your control. When you see this clearly, you begin to soften. You stop demanding that life conform to your preferences. You begin to flow with what is. This does not mean you like everything that happens. Acceptance is not approval. Acceptance means acknowledging what is present without inner conflict. When anger arises, instead of resisting it, you allow it to be there. When disappointment comes, you do not push it away. You stay present, you breathe, you feel. Resistance dissolves the moment you stop trying to escape experience. Buddhism teaches that emotions become unbearable only when they are resisted. When you allow an emotion fully, without labeling it as wrong or dangerous, it naturally changes. Anger cannot survive in full awareness. It feeds on tension, judgment, and resistance. When these are removed, anger loses its structure. It may still arise, but it no longer dominates. The same applies to people. Much anger comes from resisting who others are. You want them to be more aware, more respectful, more understanding, more aligned with your values. Buddhism teaches that clinging to this desire creates suffering. People act according to their level of awareness. Expecting more than they can give creates frustration. When you accept people as they are, you stop fighting a battle you were never meant to win. Acceptance does not mean you tolerate harm. It means you see clearly. You stop wasting emotional energy trying to change others internally. You choose your actions wisely. You set boundaries calmly. You walk away without resentment. Acceptance allows you to act from clarity instead of anger. One of the most misunderstood ideas in Buddhism is equanimity. Equanimity is not emotional numbness. It is emotional balance. It is the ability to remain steady regardless of circumstances. This steadiness comes from non-resistance. When you stop pushing against life, you stop being pushed around by it. As resistance fades, trust emerges. You begin to trust the process of life. You trust that you can handle discomfort. You trust that emotions will pass. You trust that clarity will arise when you stop forcing answers. This trust removes urgency. Urgency is a major fuel for anger. When you no longer feel rushed to fix, correct, or control, the nervous system relaxes. Buddhism teaches that much of anger is stored in the body. Tight shoulders, clenched jaw, shallow breath, and rigid posture are signs of resistance. When you practice acceptance, the body softens. The breath deepens. The nervous system shifts from fight or flight to calm awareness. Peace is not created mentally alone. It is embodied. As you live with less resistance, your perception of life changes. Situations that once felt personal now feel neutral. Words that once cut deeply now pass through without leaving a mark. This does not happen because you become indifferent, but because you are no longer in opposition to reality. You are aligned with it. At this stage, anger becomes rare, not because you suppress it, but because the conditions that create it are no longer present. There is less attachment, less control, less resistance. You move through life with openness. You allow experiences to arise and pass without clinging or pushing away. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not found by perfecting circumstances, but by perfecting your relationship with circumstances. When you stop resisting life, life stops feeling heavy. You no longer wake up prepared to defend yourself emotionally. You wake up present. This is where peace becomes natural. You are no longer practicing calm. You are calm. Reactions slow. Thoughts soften. The mind becomes spacious. Even when challenges arise, they do not disturb your center. You meet them fully, without panic, without anger, without inner conflict. At this level, you no longer ask how to stop being angry. You live in a way that anger cannot survive. Your life becomes an expression of acceptance, awareness, and ease. This is not the absence of strength. It is the deepest form of strength. The strength of a mind that no longer fights reality. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is not a dramatic event, but a quiet understanding that unfolds gradually. Each moment of non-resistance brings you closer to freedom. Each moment of acceptance weakens suffering. Eventually, peace is no longer something you seek. It is something you rest in. When you stop resisting life, you stop resisting yourself. And when you stop resisting yourself, nothing can disturb your peace. This is the end of anger. Not by force, not by suppression, but by understanding so deep that anger no longer has a reason to arise. 9. When you stop identifying with the ego, anger loses its last place to hide. At the deepest layer of anger lies the ego, not the loud ego that wants attention, but the quiet ego that wants protection. Buddhism teaches that ego is not arrogance. Ego is identification. It is the belief that there is a solid me inside that must be defended, respected, validated, and preserved. Anger arises when this imagined self feels threatened. Someone disagrees with you, ignores you, disrespects you, or treats you unfairly, and immediately the mind reacts because it believes something essential about me is under attack. The problem is not the event. The problem is the belief that there is a fixed self that can be damaged. Buddhism gently dismantles this belief. It teaches that what you call self is a collection of thoughts, memories, emotions, habits, and conditioning constantly changing from moment to moment. There is no permanent core that needs defending. When you see this clearly, anger begins to lose its foundation. If there is no solid self, then what exactly is being attacked? If there is nothing fixed to protect, then what exactly needs to react? Most anger is an unconscious attempt to preserve identity. You get angry when your intelligence is questioned, when your values are challenged, when your status feels diminished, or when your intentions are misunderstood. These reactions come from the ego's fear of losing control over how it is seen. Buddhism teaches that this fear is based on illusion. The image others have of you is already outside your control. Fighting to protect it only creates suffering. When you begin to observe the ego instead of obeying it, a profound shift occurs. You notice how quickly the mind creates a story of offense. You notice how it labels others as wrong and itself as right. You notice how it demands justification, apology, or victory. Watching this process with awareness weakens it. The ego thrives on identification. Observation breaks identification. The moment you see the ego clearly, it begins to dissolve. Buddhism does not ask you to destroy the ego, it asks you to understand it. When you understand that ego is simply a pattern of thought trying to maintain continuity, you stop taking it personally. Anger becomes less convincing because you no longer believe its story. You no longer feel compelled to defend every thought, every opinion, every emotional reaction. Silence becomes easier. Letting go becomes natural. As ego identification weakens, humility arises without effort. You no longer feel the need to dominate conversations or correct others. You no longer feel personally attacked by disagreement. You can listen without preparing a defense. You can be wrong without feeling diminished. This humility is not weakness. It is freedom from constant self-protection. One of the greatest sources of anger is comparison. Ego measures itself against others continuously. Who is right? Who is respected? Who is ahead? Buddhism teaches that comparison is suffering because it keeps the mind trapped in identity. When you stop comparing, anger loses another source of fuel. You no longer need to prove anything. You no longer need to win. You no longer need to be seen a certain way. At this stage, anger becomes rare and short-lived. It may arise briefly as a conditioned response, but it fades quickly because there is nothing solid to cling to it. The mind recognizes the pattern and lets it pass. You no longer build narratives around irritation. You no longer replay insults. You no longer carry resentment forward. Each moment stands alone. This does not mean you become passive or detached from life. On the contrary, you become more present. When ego drops away, clarity increases. You act from wisdom rather than reaction. You speak when speech serves truth. You remain silent when silence serves peace. Your actions become precise instead of emotional. Buddhism teaches that true compassion arises when ego identification fades. When you are no longer defending a self, you can truly see others. You see their confusion, their fear, their conditioning. You stop taking their behavior as a personal statement. Compassion replaces anger not because you force it, but because understanding leaves no room for hostility. As this understanding deepens, peace becomes stable. It no longer depends on conditions. Praise does not inflate you. Criticism does not wound you. Respect does not define you. Disrespect does not diminish you. You move through life lightly because there is nothing heavy to carry. The ego no longer anchors you to emotional turbulence. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not found by improving the ego, but by seeing through it. When you stop identifying with egoic patterns, anger loses its final refuge. There is nothing left to defend, nothing left to protect, nothing left to react on your behalf. At this level, peace is no longer something you practice. It is who you are when false identification falls away. You are present, aware, grounded, and open. Life continues with all its unpredictability, but it no longer shakes you at the core. You respond instead of react. You understand instead of judge. You let go instead of hold on. This is not emotional numbness. This is emotional maturity. You feel fully, but you are not ruled by what you feel. Anger may appear briefly, but it finds no ground. It passes like a ripple on water that quickly returns to stillness. When ego identification dissolves, anger has nowhere left to hide, and what remains is not emptiness, but quiet strength, deep clarity, and a peace that does not depend on anyone behaving differently. This is the freedom Buddhism points to, not the freedom to control life, but the freedom to meet life without resistance, fear, or anger. 10. When you fully accept impermanence, anger dissolves at its root. At the deepest level of wisdom in Buddhism lies a truth so simple and so profound that once it is fully understood, anger no longer has a reason to arise. This truth is impermanence. Everything changes. Every feeling, every situation, every relationship, every thought, every body, every success, every failure, every insult, every praise, and every moment of life is in constant motion. Nothing stays. Nothing holds its shape. Anger survives only where the mind forgets this truth. Most anger is born from the illusion that something should remain stable. You expect people to stay respectful, situations to remain fair, and life to unfold according to what feels right to you. When change appears in the form of disappointment, betrayal, loss, or disrespect, the mind reacts because it believed stability was guaranteed. Buddhism teaches that this belief is the deepest misunderstanding of life. When you truly understand impermanence, not intellectually but experientially, something inside you relaxes. You stop being shocked by change. You stop being offended by inconsistency. You stop being angry at people for being human. You realize that moods change, opinions shift, loyalty fades, and circumstances turn without warning. This understanding does not make you pessimistic. It makes you realistic, grounded, and free. Anger often feels justified because the mind believes that something permanent has been violated. But what if nothing was permanent to begin with? What if the harsh words spoken to you were never meant to define you? What if the disrespect you experienced was never a stable truth about you or the other person? What if it was simply a moment, arising and passing like everything else? Buddhism teaches that clinging to temporary events, as if they were permanent, is the root of suffering. When someone insults you, the pain comes not from the words, but from holding on to them. The mind replays the moment, attaches meaning to it, and tries to freeze it in time. Impermanence dissolves this habit. You see the insult as a sound that arose and faded. You see the emotion as a wave that rose and fell. You see the moment as already gone. Anger depends on memory. Impermanence dissolve memory's grip. This understanding also transforms how you see yourself. You stop demanding that you always feel strong, calm, confident, or composed. You allow yourself to change. You allow emotions to come and go without judgment. When anger arises, you do not panic or condemn yourself. You know it will pass, because everything passes. This knowledge removes fear, and fear is a hidden fuel for anger. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises when we try to hold on to what is already slipping away. Youth fades, relationships evolve, respect fluctuates, control dissolves. When you stop fighting this truth, life becomes lighter. You stop exhausting yourself trying to preserve moments, identities, or feelings that were never meant to stay. Anger fades because resistance fades. Impermanence also frees you from resentment. Resentment is anger stretched across time. It exists only because the mind refuses to let go of a moment that has already ended. When you deeply accept that the past no longer exists, resentment loses its foundation. You stop carrying yesterday's pain into today. Each moment stands alone, fresh and unburdened. This realization does not make you careless. It makes you present. When you know that moments are fleeting, you value clarity over reaction. You value peace over proving a point. You value understanding over emotional victory. You stop wasting energy on conflicts that will soon be forgotten anyway. Anger feels heavy compared to the lightness of impermanence. At this stage, forgiveness becomes natural, not forced, not moralized, but effortless. You forgive because there is nothing solid left to hold on to. The person who hurt you has already changed. You have already changed. The moment itself has dissolved. What remains to be angry at? Buddhism teaches that forgiveness is not something you do for others. It is what happens when impermanence is fully understood. As this understanding deepens, fear of loss weakens. Fear is closely tied to anger. When you fear losing respect, control, or identity, anger rises to protect what you think you might lose. Impermanence reveals that loss is unavoidable, but suffering is optional. When you accept that everything changes, you stop clinging. When clinging ends, anger ends. At this final stage, peace no longer depends on discipline, techniques, or constant mindfulness. It becomes natural. You move through life with softness. Praise touches you lightly. Criticism passes through without damage. Conflict arises and dissolves without leaving scars. You do not suppress anger, you simply do not generate it. This does not mean you never feel intensity. It means intensity does not turn into suffering. You feel emotions fully, but you do not imprison yourself inside them. You allow life to move. You allow yourself to move with it. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not found by creating a perfect life, but by seeing life clearly. Impermanence is not a depressing truth. It is a freeing one. When you stop demanding permanence from a world built on change, anger loses its final illusion. At this point, you no longer ask how to stop being angry. The question itself dissolves. You live with awareness so deep that anger rarely arises and never stays. You respond instead of react. You understand instead of judge. You let go instead of hold tight. This is not emotional numbness. This is deep peace. A peace that does not depend on people behaving correctly. A peace that does not collapse when life shifts. A peace rooted in reality as it is, not as the ego wishes it to be. When impermanence is fully accepted, anger has nowhere left to grow. What remains is clarity, compassion, and a calm that flows naturally with life. This is the final freedom Buddhism points toward. Not escape from the world, but complete harmony with it. 11. When you stop seeking peace, you finally live from it. At this stage of understanding, Buddhism points to a subtle truth that many seekers overlook. As long as you are trying to become calm, trying to eliminate anger, or trying to protect peace, there is still struggle, there is still effort. And wherever there is effort rooted in desire, tension quietly survives. True peace does not come from chasing calm or fixing emotions. It comes from stopping the inner struggle altogether. Peace is not something you reach. Peace is what remains when you stop fighting what is already here. Most people unknowingly turn peace into another goal. They want to be calm so they can finally feel safe. They want to stop anger so they can feel superior, healed, or complete. Buddhism teaches that this very wanting creates subtle agitation. The mind divides experience into what should be present and what should not be present. As long as this division exists, inner conflict continues. Even the desire to be peaceful can become a form of resistance against life. When anger arises and you think, "I should not feel this," resistance is created. When irritation appears and you try to replace it with calm, tension forms underneath. Buddhism invites you to drop this struggle completely. You allow what arises to arise, not because you approve of it, but because reality does not need your approval to exist. The moment you stop arguing with your inner experience, something profound happens. Peace appears on its own, without effort. This is one of the deepest shifts in awareness. You realize that peace was never missing. It was only covered by striving. The mind that stops trying to be peaceful becomes peaceful. The heart that stops defending itself softens naturally. Anger fades not because you pushed it away, but because you no longer feed it with resistance. At this stage, you no longer label emotions as problems. You no longer categorize experience as good or bad. You see everything as movement passing through awareness. thoughts come and go. Feelings rise and fall. Situations change. You remain present without interference. This non-interference is the foundation of true calm. Buddhism teaches that suffering is created by the second arrow. The first arrow is what happens. The second arrow is the reaction to what happens. At earlier stages, you learn to pause, observe, and let go. At this stage, the second arrow is not fired at all. Not because you suppress reaction, but because there is no longer a belief that reaction is necessary. Life happens, and you stay open. This openness creates a quiet strength. When people provoke you, you no longer feel the urge to respond immediately, not because you are restraining yourself, but because there is nothing to prove. When situations go wrong, the mind does not collapse into complaint, not because you force acceptance, but because resistance no longer feels natural. The nervous system settles, the body relaxes. Présence deepens. At this level, anger becomes rare and short-lived. It may arise briefly as an old habit, but it dissolves quickly because there is no identification with it. You do not say, "I am angry," or "I should not be angry." You simply notice sensation, breath, and movement. The emotion completes itself and leaves. Nothing remains. This stage also changes how you relate to silence. Silence is no longer a strategy. It becomes your natural state. You speak when clarity arises and remain silent when words are unnecessary. There is no internal pressure to fill space, no anxiety about being misunderstood, no need to manage impressions. This silence is not emptiness. It is fullness without noise. Buddhism teaches that true freedom is effortlessness. When effort drops, life flows. You stop managing yourself constantly. You stop monitoring emotions. You stop correcting inner states. Awareness takes care of itself. Calm becomes stable because it is no longer dependent on conditions. Even in difficult moments, something inside you remains untouched. Pain may arise, but suffering does not dominate. Conflict may appear, but peace is not destroyed. You understand now that peace is not fragile. It is not something that can be broken by words or situations. It is what you are when you stop interfering with experience. At this stage, compassion deepens naturally. Because you are no longer defending yourself, you can truly see others. You recognize their reactivity, their fear, their confusion. You do not take it personally. Compassion is not something you practice intentionally. It arises on its own when egoic struggle fades. Life begins to feel lighter. You move slower. You listen more. You react less. Even strong situations do not pull you off center. You no longer wake up bracing yourself emotionally. You wake up present. This presence is not dramatic. It is simple, quiet, and stable. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is not an achievement. It is the end of unnecessary effort. When you stop seeking peace, peace reveals itself as your natural condition. Anger dissolves because there is no longer a mind trying to control experience. Calm remains because nothing is fighting it. At this final stage, you no longer ask how to stay unbothered. You live in a way where being bothered feels unnatural. You meet life openly, honestly, and without resistance. You do not escape challenges. You face them without inner conflict. This is not indifference. This is deep intimacy with life. You feel fully, yet remain free. You engage fully, yet stay centered. You live fully, yet remain calm. When seeking ends, peace begins. And once peace becomes your ground, anger has nowhere left to return. 12. When you see clearly, nothing needs to be fixed, and nothing can disturb you. At this stage, Buddhism points to a realization that quietly completes the journey. It is the understanding that life does not need to be corrected in order for peace to exist. Most anger, frustration, and emotional disturbance come from the belief that something is wrong and must be fixed immediately. The mind scans reality constantly, searching for flaws, threats, disrespect, mistakes, or injustice. This scanning creates tension. Buddhism teaches that this habit is not awareness. It is fear disguised as vigilance. When clarity deepens, you begin to see that life unfolds exactly as it does because of countless causes and conditions coming together. People behave according to their conditioning. Situations arise according to circumstances beyond any single person's control. When you truly see this, the urge to fix everything softens. Not because you become careless, but because you understand what is actually within your power and what is not. Seeing clearly means understanding that anger does not improve situations. It only clouds perception. When the mind is angry, it believes it sees truth, but in reality, it sees distortion. Buddhism teaches that wisdom arises from stillness, not agitation. When the mind settles, understanding appears naturally. You no longer rush to correct, confront, or react. You respond only when response is necessary and beneficial. At this stage, you no longer feel responsible for managing other people's emotions, behavior, or understanding. You stop carrying the burden of making others reasonable, fair, or aware. This release brings immense relief. You recognize that every being is on their own path of learning. Trying to force insight onto others only creates conflict. Clarity teaches patience. This does not mean you become passive in the face of harm. It means your actions come from insight rather than emotional charge. When boundaries are needed, you set them calmly. When distance is required, you take it without resentment. When words are useful, you speak with precision. When silence serves peace, you remain silent. There is no inner argument about what you should do. Action arises naturally from understanding. As clarity deepens, you also stop trying to fix yourself emotionally. Earlier, you may have tried to eliminate anger, fear, sadness, or irritation. Now you see that emotions are simply movements within awareness. They do not define you, and they do not need correction. When anger arises, you see it clearly. Because it is seen clearly, it does not stay long. There is no struggle, and without struggle, emotions complete themselves. Buddhism teaches that suffering continues only where there is confusion. When confusion dissolves, suffering dissolves with it. This clarity is not intellectual knowledge. It is lived understanding. You feel it in the body as ease. You feel it in the breath as openness. You feel it in the mind as spaciousness. At this level, life no longer feels like a series of problems. Challenges still arise, but they do not feel personal. They feel like situations to be met, not enemies to be fought. The mind no longer tightens around difficulty. It remains flexible. This flexibility is one of the clearest signs of inner freedom. Clarity also transforms how you see others. You stop labeling people as obstacles or threats. You see them as expressions of their own causes and conditions. This understanding naturally gives rise to compassion. Compassion here is not emotional sympathy. It is clear seeing without judgment. You do not excuse harmful behavior, but you do not carry hatred either. Hatred requires confusion. Clarity leaves no room for it. When you live from clarity, anger feels unnecessary. You see situations accurately, so there is no need to react defensively. You understand impermanence, so you do not cling. You understand ego, so you do not defend identity. You understand suffering, so you do not personalize behavior. All previous lessons come together here as a single way of seeing. At this stage, peace is not fragile. It does not depend on silence, comfort, or agreement. It exists even in noise, conflict, and uncertainty. This peace is not excitement or pleasure. It is steadiness, a deep inner steadiness that remains even when circumstances shift. Buddhism teaches that true freedom is clarity without resistance. You see what is, and because you see it clearly, you are not disturbed by it. You no longer need life to be different for you to be okay. You are okay because you are no longer arguing with reality. Daily life becomes simple. Ordinary moments feel complete. You eat when hungry, rest when tired, speak when necessary, and remain silent when not. There is no inner commentary judging experience. This simplicity is not dull. It is alive, present, and grounded. At this point, anger has no place to take root. Not because you suppress it, but because misunderstanding has ended. When there is nothing to fix, nothing feels broken. When nothing feels broken, nothing provokes reaction. This is not the end of life's challenges. It is the end of unnecessary suffering. You continue to live fully, but without inner conflict. You engage with the world, but you are no longer entangled in it emotionally. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not leaving the world. It is seeing the world clearly. When you see clearly, compassion flows naturally, action becomes skillful, and peace remains stable. At this final stage, you do not claim to be unbothered. You simply are. Life moves, and you move with it. People speak, and you listen without resistance. Situations change, and you adapt without anger. Nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be controlled. Nothing needs to be resisted. And in this seeing, anger dissolves completely, not as an achievement, but as a natural consequence of understanding. 13. When peace becomes who you are, nothing can enter to disturb it. At this final stage, Buddhism points not to a new technique, belief, or practice, but to embodiment. Peace is no longer something you remember to apply. It is no longer something you protect, maintain, or recover after disturbance. Peace becomes the ground you stand on. It becomes the way you meet life before thought even arises. At this point, anger does not disappear because you defeated it. It disappears because there is no longer an inner structure that produces it. Earlier, peace depended on effort. You paused, observed, reflected, and let go. Those practices were necessary because the mind was still conditioned to react. But now something fundamental has shifted. The mind no longer rushes outward in search of validation, control, or safety. It rests inwardly, naturally, without force. When peace becomes your baseline, external events lose their ability to penetrate deeply. They may touch the surface, but they do not disturb the core. Buddhism teaches that suffering continues as long as identity is unstable. When you believe you are your emotions, your thoughts, or your roles, you feel constantly exposed. Every comment feels personal. Every situation feels threatening. But when peace becomes embodied, identity loosens completely. You no longer feel like a fragile self moving through a dangerous world. You feel like awareness itself, open, grounded, and steady. From this place, anger has no target. At this stage, reactions are replaced by responses so subtle they almost feel invisible. Someone may speak harshly, and instead of a surge of emotion, there is space. Someone may misunderstand you, and instead of urgency to correct them, there is patience. A situation may collapse unexpectedly, and instead of panic, there is clarity. This is not emotional numbness. This is emotional intelligence so refined that disturbance no longer forms. Embodied peace also changes how the body lives. The nervous system is no longer locked in vigilance. The shoulders soften, the breath deepens, the jaw relaxes. Even in challenging environments, the body does not brace for impact. Buddhism teaches that when the mind stops fighting life, the body follows. Calm is not only mental, it becomes physical, cellular, and instinctive. At this level, you no longer rehearse conversations in your head. You no longer replay past conflicts. You no longer imagine future confrontations. The mind rests in the present because it no longer needs to protect an image or prepare defenses. Presence becomes effortless. Silence becomes comfortable. Stillness feels alive rather than empty. Peace as embodiment also transforms how you relate to action. You still act decisively when needed, but without emotional charge. You say no without guilt. You walk away without resentment. You speak truth without aggression. Action arises from clarity, not from reaction. Buddhism teaches that this is right action, not because it follows rules, but because it flows from understanding. At this stage, compassion deepens beyond intention. You no longer try to be compassionate, you simply see clearly. When you see suffering clearly, compassion happens automatically. You recognize confusion in others without judging it. You recognize pain without absorbing it. You recognize ignorance without fighting it. This compassion does not drain you because it is not emotional attachment. It is wisdom expressed as kindness. One of the clearest signs of embodied peace is that you stop needing closure. You no longer need apologies, explanations, or acknowledgement. You understand that most people cannot meet you from awareness. You do not wait for them to change in order to be at peace. You have already stepped out of the cycle that demanded completion from the outside world. Time itself begins to feel different. You are no longer rushing ahead mentally or dragging the past with you. Moments feel complete as they arise. There is less urgency, less pressure, less internal commentary. Life slows down not because circumstances change, but because resistance has ended. Buddhism teaches that true freedom is being at home wherever you are. At this stage, you no longer need special conditions to feel calm. Noise does not disturb you. Silence does not excite you. Praise does not inflate you. Criticism does not diminish you. You remain the same in all conditions, not rigidly, but fluidly. This does not mean challenges stop appearing. It means challenges stop becoming suffering. Difficulty arises, and you meet it fully. Pain arises, and you feel it without collapse. Conflict appears, and you navigate it without losing yourself. Peace does not eliminate intensity. It holds intensity without being overwhelmed by it. At this level, anger cannot return because the roots that once fed it are gone. There is no attachment demanding satisfaction. There is no ego requiring defense. There is no resistance arguing with reality. There is no fear needing control. Anger has nowhere to anchor itself. You do not feel proud of this state. Pride would imply identity again. You simply live. You move through the world quietly, clearly, and with ease. Others may sense something different about you. They may feel calmer around you. They may feel unsettled. It does not matter. You are not trying to transmit anything. You are simply being. Buddhism teaches that awakening is ordinary. It is not fireworks or constant bliss. It is the end of unnecessary inner noise. It is drinking water when thirsty. It is resting when tired. It is listening without judgment. It is responding without anger. It is living without inner conflict. At this final stage, peace does not need explanation. It does not announce itself. It does not defend itself. It simply is. And because it is no longer fragile, nothing can disturb it. This is not the absence of life. This is life lived without friction. This is not control. This is freedom. This is not suppression. This is understanding so complete that anger never needs to arise again. And from here, there is nothing more to seek, nothing more to fix, and nothing more to escape. Only life, met fully, quietly, and in peace. 14. When life tries to break you, peace remains because it is no longer conditional. At this stage, Buddhism speaks not to ideal moments, but to the hardest ones. This lesson is not about calm when life is gentle. It is about calm when life presses against you with weight, uncertainty, injustice, and loss. True peace is not proven in silence or comfort. It is revealed when circumstances are harsh and you remain unshaken. When peace survives pressure, it is no longer fragile. It is real. Earlier, peace depended on awareness, practice, and understanding. Now peace depends on nothing. It does not disappear when plans fail. It does not collapse when people disappoint you. It does not leave when life becomes unfair. At this stage, peace is no longer something you maintain. It is something you stand on. Life can shake around you, but it cannot enter you. Buddhism teaches that suffering deepens when we believe life should protect us from difficulty. When hardship arrives, the mind often feels betrayed. It asks, "Why is this happening to me?" This question itself creates suffering. At this stage, that question no longer arises. You understand that life includes loss, conflict, uncertainty, and pain. You do not feel singled out. You do not feel attacked by existence. Difficulty is no longer personal. When life becomes intense, most people contract inward. The body tightens, the mind panics, the heart hardens. At this stage, the opposite happens. You soften, you breathe. You remain open, This openness is not weakness. It is trust rooted in clarity. You trust that you can meet what arises without losing yourself. Because of this trust, fear does not transform into anger. Buddhism teaches that anger often hides fear. Fear of losing control, fear of losing identity, fear of being overwhelmed. At this stage, fear loses authority. You have seen that emotions rise and fall. You have seen that situations change. You have seen that identity is not fixed. Because of this, when life applies pressure, the mind does not scramble for defense. It stays present. This is where peace becomes resilient, not because you suppress emotion, but because emotion no longer threatens your sense of being. Sadness may appear, grief may arise, disappointment may linger. But these experiences do not turn into bitterness or rage. They move through awareness without becoming enemies. You allow pain without turning it into suffering. At this level, you no longer measure peace by how you feel emotionally. Peace is no longer comfort. Peace is stability. You may feel tired, heavy, or uncertain, yet remain deeply grounded. Buddhism teaches that this kind of peace is not emotional pleasure. It is inner alignment with reality as it is. Life will test this alignment. People will misunderstand you. Situations will collapse unexpectedly. Effort will not always lead to reward. At earlier stages, these moments triggered resistance. Now they do not. You may still respond, adjust, or walk away, but without inner rebellion. There is no silent rage at how things should have been. One of the clearest signs of this stage is how you handle unfairness. When treated unfairly, the ego usually demands justice immediately. It wants recognition, apology, or revenge. At this stage, you still recognize injustice, but you do not poison yourself with anger. You act wisely if action is needed. You let go if action would only create more harm. You understand that peace is not restored through emotional retaliation. Buddhism teaches that inner freedom is revealed when outer conditions do not dictate inner states. At this stage, you experience that truth directly. Even in chaos, something inside remains unmoved. This does not make you detached from life. It makes you deeply present. You engage fully, but without losing center. Another mark of this stage is patience without strain. Earlier, patience required effort. You endured situations while holding tension inside. Now patience is effortless. You are not waiting for things to improve in order to relax. You are relaxed while things unfold. Time no longer feels like an enemy. Delays no longer feel threatening. You are no longer rushing life to meet your expectations. This stage also changes how you experience loss. Loss still hurts, but it does not shatter you. You grieve without collapsing. You feel sadness without drowning in it. Buddhism teaches that suffering is not pain itself, but resistance to pain. At this stage, resistance has ended. Loss is met fully, honestly, and openly. Because of this, it passes through without leaving resentment behind. Peace here is not dramatic, it is quiet endurance. It is the ability to sit with what cannot be fixed and still remain kind. It is the ability to move forward without bitterness. It is the ability to live without closing the heart, even after being hurt. At this level, you no longer need to protect peace aggressively. You do not withdraw from life to remain calm. You do not avoid people to stay unbothered. You live openly. You participate. You risk disappointment. Peace remains because it is no longer dependent on outcomes. Buddhism teaches that awakening is tested not in meditation halls, but in ordinary life, in traffic, in conflict, in failure, in loss, in fatigue. At this stage, peace passes every test. Not because you are perfect, but because you no longer resist imperfection. Anger no longer returns because its final fuel is gone. There is no belief that life owes you ease. There is no belief that people must behave correctly for you to be okay. There is no belief that discomfort means something is wrong. These beliefs once fed anger. Without them, anger starves. You do not claim to be unbothered. You simply live unbothered. Not because nothing touches you, but because nothing controls you. This is not emotional armor. It is emotional freedom. Life can press hard, and still you stand steady, not rigid, not numb, but grounded, open, and alive. This is the peace that remains when life tries to break you and fails, because there is nothing fragile left to break. 15. When there is nothing left to protect, you are finally free. This final lesson is not about learning something new, it is about seeing what has quietly disappeared along the way. Anger fades completely when there is nothing left inside you that feels threatened. At the deepest level, anger has always been a form of protection. It rose to defend identity, expectations, beliefs, wounds, pride, control, and fear. Now, all of those layers have softened. What remains does not need protection, and what does not need protection cannot be provoked. Buddhism teaches that the root of suffering is clinging to ideas of who you are, clinging to how others should behave, clinging to outcomes, respect, meaning, fairness, and certainty. Throughout this journey, each layer of clinging has been gently released, not through force, but through understanding. Now, when something happens that once would have ignited anger, there is no internal structure for it to land on. The moment passes, untouched. At this stage, there is no longer an inner narrative saying, "This should not be happening to me." There is no inner voice demanding explanation or justice. There is no urge to correct reality. Life is allowed to unfold as it does. You respond where response is useful. You remain still where stillness is wiser. There is no emotional urgency driving your actions. Earlier, peace felt like something you could lose. Now it is something you live from. It does not rise and fall with circumstances. It does not need silence, comfort, agreement, or control. It remains present even when emotions arise. You may still feel sadness, fatigue, disappointment, or grief, but these experiences do not turn into suffering. They are allowed, felt, and released. Anger no longer appears because there is no resistance underneath. One of the clearest signs of this stage is how lightly you move through conflict. Conflict no longer feels like a threat to your identity. You can disagree without hostility. You can say no without guilt. You can walk away without resentment. You are no longer trying to win emotionally. You are no longer trying to protect an image. You are simply being truthful and present. Buddhism teaches that when the self becomes light, the world becomes light. Not because the world changes, but because you are no longer carrying it inside you. You stop carrying people's opinions. You stop carrying past moments. You stop carrying imagined futures. Each moment arrives clean and leaves clean. At this level, forgiveness is no longer a practice. It is a natural consequence of not clinging. You forgive because there is nothing left to hold on to. You forgive because you see clearly that people act from their own conditioning. You forgive because the past no longer feels alive inside you. Forgiveness happens without effort, without pride, and without announcement. Another sign of this stage is deep ease with uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty created anxiety and anger because the mind wanted guarantees. Now, uncertainty feels natural. Life has always been uncertain. You are no longer fighting that truth. You meet the unknown with openness instead of fear. This openness removes tension from the nervous system and creates deep inner stability. At this stage, silence becomes your natural language. Not because you avoid speaking, but because words are no longer used to defend, prove, or control. When you speak, your words are clear and measured. When you are silent, there is no pressure to fill the space. Silence feels complete. Presence fills the room without effort. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not the absence of difficulty, it is the absence of inner conflict. Difficulty may still appear in life, but there is no longer an internal battle. You do not argue with what is. You do not resist what cannot be changed. You do not poison yourself emotionally over what has already happened. Life moves, and you move with it. At this final stage, anger cannot return, because its purpose has ended. Anger was once a strategy for survival. It believed it was protecting you. Now, understanding has replaced that strategy. Awareness has replaced reaction. Acceptance has replaced resistance. There is nothing left for anger to do. You do not feel special for reaching this stage. In fact, the sense of being someone who has arrived does not arise. That would be another identity to protect. You simply live. You wake up, engage with the world, rest when tired, act when necessary, and let go when finished. Life becomes ordinary again, but without suffering layered on top. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is deeply ordinary. It is drinking water when thirsty. It is listening without judgment. It is feeling pain without hatred. It is responding without reactivity. It is living without inner noise. At this point, peace is no longer something you talk about. It does not need explanation. It does not need validation. It expresses itself through your presence, your tone, your patience, and your clarity. People may notice something calm about you. They may not. It does not matter. You are not here to be seen. You are here to live freely. Nothing needs to be defended anymore. Not your past, not your beliefs, not your emotions, not your image, not your peace. And because nothing needs protection, nothing can threaten you. This is not detachment from life. This is intimacy with life without fear. This is not control. This is trust. This is not effort. This is ease. This is not the absence of emotion. This is freedom from being ruled by emotion. This is the end of the struggle with anger, not because anger was conquered, but because understanding made it unnecessary. And from here, there is no further lesson, no higher step, and no final achievement. Only life, unfolding naturally, met with awareness, compassion, and unshakable calm. At the beginning of this journey, anger may have felt like something unavoidable, something caused by people, situations, or the unfairness of life itself. It may have seemed natural, justified, even necessary. But step by step, layer by layer, you have seen something deeper. Anger was never the enemy. It was a signal. A response born from misunderstanding, attachment, resistance, and fear. And as understanding grew, anger quietly lost its purpose. You learned that anger does not come from others, but from expectations held tightly inside. You learned that what bothers you reveals where the mind was still untrained, not where life was wrong. You learned that silence becomes strength when the ego no longer demands validation. You discovered that emotions are not who you are, but experiences passing through awareness. You saw that people act from their own suffering, not from a desire to harm you. You learned to pause, to release control, to stop resisting life, and to see through the illusion of a fixed self. As each layer fell away, peace stopped being something you practiced and became something you lived from. You stopped seeking calm and discovered that calm was already here. You stopped trying to fix life and began seeing it clearly. You stopped protecting identity and realized nothing needed defense. And in that realization, anger had nowhere left to arise. This is not a state of perfection, it is a state of honesty. Life will still move, people will still change, loss will still come, challenges will still arise. But now, these experiences no longer turn into inner conflict. Pain may appear, but suffering no longer dominates. Emotions may arise, but they no longer control you. You are no longer fighting reality. You are meeting it. Buddhism does not promise a life without difficulty. It offers something far greater, a life without unnecessary suffering, a life where peace does not depend on comfort, silence, or control, a life where anger no longer dictates your words, your actions, or your inner world. From here, there is nothing more to achieve, no final identity to claim, no label to wear. The journey ends not with accomplishment, but with simplicity. You live, you respond, you rest. You let go, you remain present. Anger ends not because you defeated it, but because you understood it fully. And when understanding is complete, struggle dissolves naturally. This is not the absence of emotion. This is freedom from being ruled by emotion. This is not withdrawal from life. This is intimacy with life without fear. This is not control. This is trust. This is not effort. This is ease. And from this place, nothing needs to be defended. Nothing needs to be resisted, and nothing has the power to disturb your peace again. Only awareness, only clarity, only quiet strength, only life unfolding naturally.